So today I want to talk about overall preset structure. Recently when I was doing the overview of some of the most popular presets on the Quad Cortex, there was one of them I was doing a little bit of rework on, and I realized as I was going through it that I've never really kind of talked about how I generally approach structuring a preset. If you've seen a lot of my presets or used them, this will be pretty familiar to you because you'll see it over and over again in terms of how I do this. And there's nothing revolutionary in this, but I thought it might be useful based on some of the presets I was seeing to talk through kind of how I approach it. So the first thing I'll say is generally I approach structuring the preset the same way I would approach structuring this stuff in the real world. So I wasn't using a digital modeler, but I was doing it analog. The structure would be generally the same. So for example, if we bring up this image, so if you've ever seen that pedal show, you may have seen one of the guys wearing this t-shirt where they lay out what they think is the proper order of effects. You can see here wah, fuzz, octave, compressor, boost, flanger, phaser, distortion, overdrive, chorus, delay, tremolo, reverb, rotaries, and then looper. So generally this is the order I try to go in. And so I try to keep to this general best practice. But with a digital modeler, you're not constricted as much as you might be when you're using a real amp. So when Dan and Mick are building a pedal board, even if they're using the amp's effects loop, there's always the amp and speaker on the end. Whereas when you're using a digital modeler, a lot of times you may put the effects after the speaker cabinet because it's more like you're working in a studio. You have all the upfront stuff that would be, say, pedals on a pedal board. You have the amp, you have the speaker, and then you can have all the studio effects, and that can be modulation, delay, reverb, however. So let's go ahead and build out a preset and just kind of talk through the general structure as we do it. So let's start off with a basic kind of one-line preset. So I've got a blank preset here, and we're going to go ahead and save this. I'm just going to call this structure demo. And let's say we want to build out a preset with a Fender amp. So I'm going to go over here, just here in the middle. I'm going to go to an amp, and we're going to use, let's use a twin. And we'll go to maybe set this to 4. Maybe just pump up the mids a little bit. Turn on the bright switch. And then we need to give it a cabinet. I'm going to use an IR loader. We'll just use a single IR here. Just use one of my favorites is this Fender 2x12. And we should have a sound. So the other thing I'll say is I always go turn on the input gate on the input block like that. And for this clean tone, let's go ahead and add a compressor. So compressor is usually one of the first things I'll have, and we'll use the Joule. Maybe go to 6 and 60%. And all right, so a nice clean tone, kind of dry. Let's add some ambient effects. So those I typically put in the far back end of the preset. So usually what I'll do is I'll put reverb at the very end. So we'll go here, we'll put on a plate lush, we'll pull back the mix a little bit, and then maybe in front of that, I would put a delay. And we'll put this at, bring that down a little bit, and we'll set it to around 400. So now we have some ambience. So let's say I want a gain in front of this amp. Like in the real world, I put that in front of the amp, obviously. So we'll go up here. Maybe we'll add in a Nobel OD1, about 4. We'll push the level up a little bit. So a nice gain there. And let's say we want some modulation. So again, typically I would approach the modulation as kind of a studio effect. So I would typically put it after the cab. So let's say we do a stereo dream course. I don't want the mix necessarily this high. Push up the depth a little bit, maybe pull back the speed. So let's talk about positioning of the effects. So like I said, I'm approaching this as if I was in a recording studio, and I'm putting the modulation ambient effects after the amp, after the cab. I would not typically put the reverb anywhere else, but sometimes for certain types of tones, you may want to put the reverb or the delay in front of the amp, or even between the amp and the IR or the cab. So to me, putting the effects between the amp and the IR is kind of like putting it in the effects loop of the amp. It's not perfect because in the effects loop of the amp, you'd be going preamp, effects, power amp, speaker. If I put the effects between the amp and the cab here, I'm going preamp, power amp, effects, speaker. So it's a slight difference in terms of the order between the effects and the power amp stage of the amp, but you could do that. And there are times that I will do that. Now, I won't go deep into this. I've done videos on this before, but if you put these effects in front of the amp or in front of the speaker, you need to be careful about losing your stereo effect. So for example, this chorus is a stereo effect. If I move it in front of the cabinet, which is a mono, suddenly my stereo chorus becomes mono. Or same thing if I move it in front of the amp. So that's something else to keep in mind. One of the reasons I like putting the effects after the amps and cabs is it allows you to use stereo effects without having to worry too much about whether or not you're kind of killing your stereo spread. And let's say we even wanted to stack more gain on the front here. I'm going to put a myth drive in front of this. Just general order, nothing revolutionary here. It's just kind of how you would do it in real life, but it's the same thing on the Quad Cortex. So let's say we want to make this a more complicated preset and we want to have two different amps. We want to have maybe a Fender and then have a Marshall for some crunch. So obviously we're out of room on row 1. I've seen some people say, well, I'm going to go to row 2 and I'll switch back and forth between the amps. You could do that. You could go like this and put a, say we'll put a plexi here, and we'll give it some crunch, maybe turn up the bass a little bit, bring the treble down and bring the presence way down, and then we'll give it a cab. But you can see here, we're out of CPU. So that's one of the reasons I don't like to do it this way, is because you run out of CPU pretty quick. The other thing is, if you're not running these amps at the same time, then you've got to really manipulate your splitter and your mixer to only be sending down one path. And I think it makes the preset hard to understand. So typically, if I'm switching back and forth between two amps, rather than run them on parallel lines and kind of route to different parallel lines, what I'll do is I will run them in series and just turn them on and off as I want them. So let's set this up for that. So let's go ahead. Instead of multi-out, we're going to send this down to row 3. And so going down to row 3, what we're doing is when you get to rows 3 and 4, you're adding in extra CPU capacity because these two rows are on a different CPU than the first two. So what we're going to do here is we're going to pull our reverb and delay to the back. We're going to bring our modulation to the back. And now typically what I would do, go ahead and do this, is in my experience, in terms of balancing the CPU, I find that the first row ends up being your pedals, your amps, and the third row starts with your cabinets, and then you do your modulation and ambient effects. So I would typically see it like this, and I would say, let's turn off the Fender stuff. Turn on the Marshall. We're going to add a cab here. I'm going to use the Mesa 4x12 with the V30s. We're going to give it a little bit of a low pass filter, not quite that much. And now we have our Marshall. It's a little quiet. Let's go ahead and pump that up. Maybe that's a little too much. Let's go ahead and turn off our up-front panels. So, if we're running this in stomp mode, what I would typically do then is I would go ahead and assign this to a foot switch. Let's assign it to D. We're going to assign this one to D, and we're going to assign the cabinets to D. Now I go over here, I would just rename this. And now if I want to balance those, typically what I'll do is I'll adjust the volume on the output volume of the amp. So I think the clean could come up a little bit. That's good enough. So now we've got a stomp that lets us switch between our amps. So we want to add more capabilities now. Let's say we want to add a flanger. Again, like with any modulation effects, you could put it in front of the amps, you can put it after the amps. I'm going to put it after the amps because I typically put these back here before the ambient effect. So let's say I want to do a digital flanger and we'll make it a little deeper. Let's see how that goes. So that sounds good. And let's go ahead and we'll stay in stomp mode and we'll just start assigning things out. So when I'm stomp mode, what I typically like to do is keep the stomps kind of representing the order they're in on the grid. So I would go here, I would go ahead and assign this to A. This one would be assigned to B. This would assign to C. And then I would go down here and I would assign this to, say, F. And this one to G. I might assign the ambient effects to a switch as well. I don't typically do that. I like to leave the ambient stuff on a lot, but you might do this. Let's say you wanted to have two different delays. So we go here and we add in a tape delay. Assign it to H. We'll set the mix to 25% and we're going to turn sync off. We'll set the delay time to somewhere around 400 and maybe push up the wow a little bit. pull back the drive. So now I can switch the delay type. So now we can have a tape delay with kind of a full-on lead tone here. So that's kind of a quick overview of generally how I structure these things. Like I said, there's nothing revolutionary here, but again, if you look at my presets, you'll see this over and over again, where you've got compressors and overdrive pedals usually up here, into the amps, cabinets are usually here on row 3, and then you get the modulation effects and ambient effects, and there's room here. If I wanted to, I could go down here. If I was going to add a doubler, I might do it here. And we're going to go ahead and turn this off. And I'm going to assign that to H. And so this way, what it's going to do is, let's say I was in a lead. When I turn on the tape delay, it's also going to turn on the doubler. Obviously, if you get into more sophisticated presets that are running stereo amps or even a wet, dry, wet, that's a completely different structure. And I've walked through that before. I'll link to that in the description if you want to see that. Wet, dry, wet can get a lot more complicated. But this is kind of just my general approach to how I structure and order things in my presets. And just given some of the things I've seen and some of the presets I've looked at online and even some of the questions I see through the Facebook groups and whatnot, I thought it might be helpful to go through it. And so I hope you did find this helpful, and thanks for watching.